unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Erik Angner, who is a professor of philosophy at Stockholm University. And he has written this book called How Economics Can Save the World, Simple Ideas to Solve Our Biggest Problem. Welcome, Erik.
Thank you. So happy to be here, Greg.
Well, look, I mean, you're a philosopher of science. That's your training.
Yep.
But you also somehow along the way got a PhD in economics. And,
That's right.
It's actually rare that a philosopher of science also, gets a doctorate in the science that they are studying, or one of the sciences that they're studying. And I've talked to a lot of philosophers of science, and most of them are interested in the natural sciences. It seems like philosophy of science has not given sufficient attention to the social sciences. And in this book, How Economics Save the World, I mean, what you're doing is you're articulating what we might think of as the economic way of thinking and what it can bring to the world. And, I remember reading a book when I was in college. I guess it was The Economic View of the World. I think it was Stephen Rhodes. Was that it? It was a pretty famous book back when I was in college. And it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that economics is not simply a discipline or a subject matter, but it is a methodology. It's an approach. And of course, soon after that, that's when rational choice took over, and there was this kind of imperialism of economics. And there's been some pushback, and you talk about anti-economics. And I'm like, wait, how can anybody be against economics? Like, we don't have anti-physics, right? I guess there is flat earth people, but, we generally don't have in respectable circles and at higher education, like an anti-physics movement or an anti-biology movement. And yet we have this kind of pushback against economics. And so I think you're exploring both sides, right? What's great about economics and also kind of why some people are uncomfortable with it. So I guess the first question is, why is philosophy of science given so little attention to the social sciences relative to the natural sciences?
So I think part of that is that there used to be an idea of like a hierarchy of the sciences, right? Where the natural sciences were better than the social sciences. There was also an idea of like reduction, where the thought was that at the end of the day, right, everything's got to reduce to physics. So if we just get the physics right and we understand how it works, then everything else will be trivial. Those ideas are broadly out of fashion now. So people think that it's worth looking at the specific sciences to see what people are up to, independently to some extent of what's going on in the other sciences. And so what I wanted to do was to explore like what we can say about economics from a philosophical perspective. And like one of the things that people might not get about economics that you were alluding to just a moment ago is just how broad it is, right? It's not just about money and finance and markets. It's about like all the decisions that people are making that relate to well-being. It's about everything we do that relates to, building community and living better lives and whatever. And the other thing that people don't get is just how closely aligned the goals of economics are with the goals of philosophy. Like, heck, historically, it hasn't even been that long since economics sort of spun off from philosophy, right? We're talking 250, 300 years, something. And the general project, figuring out how to live a good life, how to build a good community, how to organize a life, given that we have to take into account other people and so on. These are core questions in philosophy, right? Since the days of Aristotle and Socrates and so on, but they're also core questions in economics. And so it really is a shame that the communities, that the disciplines split and that the communities are so separate, because so much of what's going on in these areas really is related. And we can learn a lot, I think, from sort of glancing at what people are doing in the other areas.
Well, one could argue that economics actually inherited that task more so than philosophy, right? Because philosophy has been preoccupied for most of the last 100 years with, meaning and of words and, epistemology and so forth, right? I mean, it's kind of, many philosophers kind of shy away from that aspect of bearing fruit, right? You talk about, and you quoted Pigou, right. And I can't believe that, here I am at my old age. It's only now that I know about this quote from Pigou about how economics is not just about bearing light, but also by bearing fruit. And that's what makes economics makes it sort of, it shares features with medicine, as you point out, right? Where there is this scientific or descriptive piece, but then there's also this kind of practical and prescriptive piece.
Right. So part of what I'm saying in the book is that there are all these like misconceptions about what economics is and what economists are up to. But it's true that the economists themselves aren't free from blame, right? The various sort of modern developments where economists spend so much time building models and so much time looking at sort of relatively narrow data sets and whatever really didn't help projecting a picture of what economics really is doing. The good news is that economics has changed. Like even over the course of my academic lifetime, it's gotten broader. Like the topics that we study in economics are wider. The data we look at is broader. And the integration, I think, with philosophy is getting deeper, although not as fast as, you know, some of us would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the toolkit of economists, and you mentioned things like lab experiments and field experiments and so forth. But those are actually relatively recent additions to the toolkit of economics. I mean, economics was primarily about theory until fairly recently, with a little bit of empirics.
Yeah, like theory got a lot of attention during, you know, the middle of the 20th century or something. The high prestige work was all in theory, effectively. And when I started as a grad student, like economic experiments were frowned upon. Behavioral economics wasn't quite seen as economics at all, if it was even conceived of as science. But that's really changed. So behavioral economics is now part of the mainstream. Economic experiments are, you know, entirely legit. You see them all over the place. And so things have changed. There's a development with neuroeconomics as well, which I don't really get into, but there are all these economists trying to integrate their work with neuroscience on the assumption that if we want to understand behavior, we've got to have a grasp on what's going on in the brain. And it turns out that neuroscientists find it helpful to collaborate with economists because they need to know the facts about the way in which people make choices and so on. So there are really fascinating developments going on, like all over the place. And the public sort of picture of what economics is and what economists are doing is like lagging by decades.
Well, I mean, you keep using the word science, but I mean, a lot of economists would say that the scientific aspect of their job is all about understanding and predicting, and they're not going to step into the arena where they are adjudicating values, right? So I think part of the underlying implication of the book is that, oh, we all want to alleviate poverty. We all want to promote happiness. You know, we all want to reduce human suffering, right? We all want to have the good life and so forth. But I mean, is that sort of, I mean, some economic scientists might feel uncomfortable, you know, wading into that discussion, right? Where you are, you know, you're saying, hey, this is where, this is our goal. They're like, hey, you know, we don't have a goal here, right?
But here's the thing, like for the longest time, economists imagined that they could proceed without any sort of attention to values, right? The thought was that economics is a science, that science requires us to ignore values, and that to the extent that values enter into our work, the work is thereby deficient in some way. But that picture is gone. It's gone, broadly speaking, in philosophy of science. And economists themselves have come to appreciate that we have to engage with values in order to do the kind of work that we need to do as economists. So Al Roth, for example, Nobel laureate, and incidentally, my first professor of economics, has made this point very effectively, I think, where he says that as economists, we're involved in like designing things. We design markets for things like kidneys, right? And when we do that, we have to pay attention to the values that people have. So in our culture, in America today, we don't think it's okay to trade kidneys, right? You can't put your kidney on eBay no matter how much you want to. Okay, Al Roth says that's a fact, right? It's a constraint. It's something that we have to pay attention to. And to the extent that economists are building things and designing things, and they're designing markets and institutions and auctions and retirement systems and healthcare systems and all sorts of things, we sort of have to begin with a picture of the end goal, right? What are we trying to build here? What do we want our healthcare system to look like? And that's a question of values. Like, you can't pretend that that's something you can settle by means of data alone, right? And this is one of the points where sort of I come in and I say, look, you can't avoid talking about values. What if we discuss the values with the philosophers who've been at it for like 2,500 years straight? It's not like the philosophers have all the answers to these questions, but they've thought through the consequences of various stances that we can take, and they're pretty good at sort of reflecting about things. And so where I end up is sort of advocating more integration between the sciences and the humanities, economics and philosophy, to sort of address these questions, which we can't sidestep no matter how much we would like to.
But look, you can be a good engineer and design, weapons of mass destruction. You can be a good business person and design addictive products. I mean, can't you be a good economist and design, say, mechanisms which achieve bad ends?
Well, I think the values enter at a more fundamental level than that. Like, even with simple things like, pairs of scissors or whatever, you think it's the sort of thing you can design as a straight up engineer or designer without paying attention to values. But there are questions about accessibility, right? Some scissors are designed for right-handed people, and left-handed people can only use them at some cost, right, with some pain. If you're going to be a good designer, if you're going to do scissors right, you have to pay attention to things like accessibility, which is, a value. Can you do bad things? Yeah, sure. But to my mind, the goal of engineering and design and economics is to make the world a better place. And if you're not involved in that project, you're either not a member of that community or you're doing it poorly.
Mm-hmm. Now, in one of the chapters, you have each chapter of the book attempts to address a specific social goal, right? Whether it's poverty or child rearing, right? Or norms or happiness, et cetera. I mean, all of these, you walk through some of the latest approaches by economists to these different disciplines, but there are these sort of underlying threads, right, that come to the surface. And, one of them, of course, is looking for the equilibrium, right? Thinking about spillovers, thinking about consequences. And, you begin the book by mentioning the COVID crisis, which I'm guessing you experienced while you were in Sweden. So you had a very different experience than people in other parts of the world.
Right. Yep.
And I was also puzzled by the lack of participation by economists in this whole debate. Even my own colleagues who were economists, they seem to be very gun shy about sort of participating in this conversation.
Yeah.
And we heard people saying, well, trust the scientists. And it's like, well, hold on a second. Aren't economists scientists?
We're right here. Yeah.
Why aren't people asking? Why aren't people, hey, let's see what the economists have to say about this?
Right. So the fundamental premise of my work is that science can help us live better lives and build a better community. And if you put it that way, it's a very old-fashioned idea, right? It's kind of hard to find people who disagree with it. There are people who will reject it, right? But by and large, sensible, educated people believe this is true. But then if you say, oh, by the way, I think that applies to economics as well, you lose so many people, especially perhaps on the political left, right? People who think of economics as sort of an ideological project aligned with promoting the values of, the capitalist class or whatever. But yet, like, what I'm trying to show in all these cases is that when it comes to the major challenges that we're facing, there's an aspect to them that's purely economic in nature and that we can address only really by reference to the best available science. So when it comes to COVID, it's such a great example of this because, of course, at bottom, in a way, the problem is medical, right? There's this little virus. It's the sort of thing we understand by means of virology and medicine and stuff. But then if you want to know how the problem emerged in the first place, well, I guess there are two leading theories, right? Either it popped up in a market where live animals were traded, or it popped up in a lab. These are economic activities, right? Trade in animals laboratory work. This is economic behavior that we can only understand in light of like supply and demand, in effect. And then if the problem had stayed in Wuhan, we wouldn't even have known about it, right? But it didn't stay in Wuhan. Why not? Well, people are traveling. People were commuting in and out of the city center. People were trading across long distances. People work. People travel for work and for enjoyment across the world. And so as a result of this, right, the problem spread across the world. And then before the vaccines came out, the only solutions available to us had to do with behavior, right? Washing hands and keeping our distance and whatever. Even after the vaccine came out, solving the problem was a matter of behavior, right? Getting people to take the vaccine, right? Continuing to act responsibly and so on. And so no matter where you are in the analysis, there's an economic aspect to this. And I was sort of shocked to see experts in medicine, virology, and so on talk about the virus and then transition to talking about behavior and then transitioning to talking about values or whatever. And they will not be an expert in all these different things. And yet all these things will matter to like what we're going to end up doing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about economics as being relevant to the domain of money alone, then I might see why you might leave it out of the conversation. But if you understand economics to be about the understanding how individual behavior results in collective outcomes, right, which is one of the big themes of economics, then, I don't understand how you could possibly leave out the use of economic thinking. I mean, because that is fundamentally at the heart of social sciences. I mean, I guess the bigger question is, where does economics end? and,
right.
and, sociology begin? I mean, I'm always having trouble. I think of economics, if it's, done well, is sort of like a clearinghouse for all of the social sciences to some degree. But that's where the imperialism part comes back in.
Yeah, I mean, it's awfully hard to draw a sharp boundary, in part because economics itself has gotten so interdisciplinary, and in part because the research teams now are so interdisciplinary. And to be perfectly honest, it's not very interesting to me either, like if we draw the line here or here. What's important to me is that economics has a role to play. Social and behavioral science can do good things for us on the margin. I mean, COVID is like so rich with examples. So I'm thinking about when they started vaccinating older people where I live, sort of the 80 plus cast. The way to get vaccinated here in Sweden was you had to have a smartphone, you had to have 3 separate apps that you needed to download from the App Store. You had to log in to verify who you were. You had to copy and paste a long arbitrary string of letters from one app to another. It was like so complicated that my mom, who is otherwise, highly educated and computer literate, she couldn't do it. Like she was sitting there with her phone and she couldn't sign up for the vaccine. And I was on the phone and I was trying to walk her through the steps. But the steps were themselves so complicated, I couldn't do it for her. And, it's not like behavioral scientists know everything, right? There's no magic in this. But the fact is, when non-behavioral scientists do things like this, they mess up like so badly, so often, that even, any master's student in the area could have helped them improve that system, by leaps and bounds. Or the COVID tests that we were expected to take all the time, like at least the ones I get here in the drugstore, they come with like an instructional sheet that's obviously written by lawyers. It's like, it's enormous, tiny, tiny print. Like my 50-year-old eyes can't read the print, right? There's no chance that my 80-year-old mother can read these instructions. And this is a question of life and death, right? Getting these tools to work for the people who are supposed to use them, especially if they're sick or in distress or whatever, is like absolutely critical. And the lawyers and IT people who do these things, evidently, much of the time, just don't have what it takes. So this is not to say that we should be imperialists, that economists should like run the show and do everything. It's just to say that if we had social and behavioral scientists that have integrated in this kind of work, we'd all be much better off for it.
Well, I mean, in engineering, we've seen that human factors, right, which is now, I guess, sometimes called design thinking, right, has played a
Yeah.
big role and is getting ever greater attention in the world of engineering. Do you think that the rise of behavioral economics represents a similar trend, a similar recognition? And I guess I've always puzzled,
Absolutely.
and I was already puzzled, like why wasn't it always there? I mean, I remember when I started studying economics, that like you, there was no behavioral economics, and so I had to go and study psychology, and I had to go study sociology. I had to go study all this stuff because it wasn't in economics, and now economics
Yeah.
has recognized it. I mean, is that just sort of like a natural trajectory of progress, or I mean, it's hard to explain what was going on in economics before all of these new integrations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there were ideas floating around in the early 20th century. There was behaviorism in psychology, right? Logical positivism in philosophy that sort of perpetuated a relatively narrow picture of like what a science can be and what can count as evidence. I think we've freed ourselves from those shackles a little bit. And when we do that, we see that all sorts of different kinds of reflection are relevant to the sort of goals that we want to attain. I think the design thinking that you mentioned is like very strongly analogous to what people are doing in behavioral economics with the nudge agenda and all that. These communities don't talk to each other to the extent that I think they should. But from the point of view of my personal history, like my dad worked with fighter jets, so he was the chief engineer of a fighter jet project, and so his entire life's work effectively was about building a cockpit that works for a real human pilot, right? It doesn't matter how good the cockpit is if you seat a rational economic man in the fighter jet. At the end of the day, it's a human being who's going to sit there, and you'd better design the thing so that it fits the person, flying the plane. And I think we should apply the same idea to things like healthcare systems and whatever, retirement systems. It doesn't matter if your retirement system is fantastic for a rational economic man if we populate the system with actual human beings, because so many of us are going to mess up in all sorts of predictable ways. And so what we have to do is to, respectfully, right, design a system that's workable for the kind of people who are going to be in it. And that means quite different working with the quite different constraints than we would do otherwise. I mean, it's kind of obvious when you state it that way, but we haven't quite thought about the problem in this way.
Yeah, I feel like progress in economics comes about as a result of people stating the obvious and then figuring out how to, work it back into theory.
Yeah. There's one thing that's kind of fascinating about the people I talk about in the book. I didn't quite see this coming, but so there are like 9 substantive chapters, right? About 9 major challenges. And each chapter highlights like 1 or maybe 2 sort of figures that I think are particularly interesting in the space.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how many of them have a background in a different discipline. So Christina
Like Al Roth was
Bicchieri has a
operations.
philosophy background. That's right. He started off as an engineer, I think, or as an aspiring engineer, and then he went into operations research. And I think there's something interesting that happens when you come from another discipline into economics or whatever, right? You notice blind spots. You bring your own blind spots, right? But they might be corrected. And then you begin to see opportunities for progress that people within the community might not have seen. And so I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of interdisciplinary research. It pays off, even if the only thing you're trying to do is to do good economics on its own terms, right? Even if you're not like trying to revolutionize the field, bringing insights from another discipline to bear on the problem at hand is just like a really smart heuristic to go about it.
Look, I want to talk about this anti-economics sentiment that you reference in the book. Because, I mean, on the one hand, there is just simply ignorance around economics, like failure to understand what economics is or having some distorted vision of it. But then there's also legitimate critiques. And so I'm wondering, within anti-economics, how much of it is just ignorance and how much of it is the kind of critique that actually helps economics to get better. I mean, I'm always astonished that there are people who are highly educated who have such a strong ignorance of economics in ways that I think would be impossible in the natural sciences. Like if somebody came to me who was if somebody was an English professor and they came to me and they said, "Oh yeah, evolution. What's that?" Like I thought, maggots just emerged out of meat spontaneously, like a la Aristotle. You'd be like, Where have you been for the last 50 years?" But I'll meet somebody who is a history PhD who will say, "Yeah, rent control that helps the homeless or something," and I'm just like, how could you possibly think that, right? Like it's kind of nuts. So how much of it is ignorant?
So I can only speculate, to be honest. But so the term anti-economics is something I picked up from historians of economics. So they've traced this back all the way back to the founding of economics, since the very beginning in like the 1700s,
Carlyle.
1800s. Carlyle, there's been like a shadow tradition of people sort of attacking economics and its influence and whatever. And I think we see this today, like every year around Nobel season, it's this time of year. There are op-ed pieces arguing that economics is not a real science, right? Economists aren't scientists, they're priests, the economics Nobel is not a real Nobel, and so on and so forth. And some of the arguments are really kind of terrible, really, really awful. This is not to say that there aren't legitimate critiques of economics, and I try to address them to the best of my ability close to the end of the book. I think it's important to recognize that there are limitations, right, to economics, the way it's conceived and the way that we practice it. But many of the arguments just completely miss the mark. And this is kind of weird. It seems to be almost like a mark of pride or a source of pride in some segments, to be ignorant of and hostile to economics, which is really a terrible shame. It doesn't matter where you are politically, right? There's going to be research in economics that's useful to the sort of project that you would like to see realized, to the sort of society that you would like to live in, whether you're on the right or the left, right? People have speculated. So one source might be that economics, the way it's practiced, is terribly abstruse, right? It's very hard to access. If you pick up a random article in like Econometrica, a leading economics journal, it's not going to make any sense to you unless you have, a PhD level training in the discipline. And so that's a problem. Another problem maybe is that economists tend to bring bad news. Very often the message is, well, there are trade-offs, right? You can't have all the things that you would like to see. You're going to have to choose between this and that. People don't like to hear that, maybe. And then there's some charlatans and cranks. There are people out there sort of presenting themselves as economists in the media, but very often, they're PR people. They might be working for a bank. They're salespeople. They're trying to sell a product, right? Or they work for think tanks of a kind where they're given a conclusion and instructed to find the argument that's going to take them there, right? There are think tanks like that. The kind of economists you see on television aren't representative of the community as a whole. And, for reasons, right? But this is a problem because if you watch, I don't know, the news on CNN or Bloomberg or something, you're not going to get a sense for what the profession is up to. And the profession itself is like so bad at describing what they're doing. Like they really need a better PR operation, right? Carlyle, right? The idea of the dismal science, which is something that people will say, maybe especially on the political left, right? Economics is the dismal science. Like, where does that come from? Well, the term comes from Carlyle, who was like viciously racist and who was pissy about the fact that economists were against slavery, because Carlyle was for it. And he dismissed the entire discipline on the basis that, it ended up objecting to slavery, where the word dismal is associated with the devil and downwards movement and darkness and the depth of despair and so on. It was an oblique reference to the color of the skin of the people he wanted to see enslaved. And, this is like such a good story about the origin of economics. And the fact that people don't know it is really like a PR disaster.
Yeah, I think most people thought that Carlyle was referring to Malthus, right, with his pessimistic view of human prosperity, and so it was and I've read Carlyle, and this was a revelation to me. I didn't realize that he was actually thinking about Mill and Bentham, right, as the
Yeah.
dismal scientists.
No, it's like perfectly explicit, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing is that you mentioned in your chapter on overconfidence, which actually I was happy to see a couple of my colleagues here at Berkeley feature prominently in that chapter, some of whom I have interviewed on my podcast. And it seems like the economists that do rise to the top, as you mentioned, are the ones that have the most overconfidence, right? You quote Harry Truman, who said, get rid of these two-handed economists, give me the one-handed economist. And, if you learn nothing else when you study economics, you do learn how to think with two hands. You learn that everything's about trade-offs, and you learn
Right.
to think about those trade-offs. And anytime anybody says, we should do X, your mind immediately starts thinking about, okay, well, what's it going to cost us? Like, what are we going to give up? What are the trade-offs? And I think that there's not a lot of demand for that, particularly in policy circles, right?
So overconfidence is like, there's an epidemic of overconfidence, right? The people you see around you are like way too sure of their own abilities and their own knowledge. And this is something that really leads to major disasters. So Don Moore, right, your colleague, has written a whole book about the various ways in which this invites disaster. One of the reasons why there's so much overconfidence is that we sort of select for it. So the people who get invited to be on television, on panels, whatever, who are they? Well, they're not the people who will say, well, we really don't have a firm handle on this problem. We need more research, whatever. The people who get invited are the ones who will say something, dramatic and, something that's going to lead to conflict and good television. And so the more serious people will just not be invited, or they won't be invited back. The people you see on television tend to be way too overconfident. And we do this on a smaller scale as well. So like in an office or in a management setting, you might be hiring, for example, right? How are you going to assess who's the most competent candidate? Well, one of the heuristics you might depend on is like, how confident are people, right? Suppose you have one guy who's like super confident, who says he can do everything because he learned it yesterday, whatever. And then you have somebody else, maybe a woman, who says, I'm sure I can figure this out, given enough time and training and whatever. And if you use their level of confidence as a marker of competence, you're going to hire the guy every time, right? But because competence and confidence don't correlate in the way that you would hope, that means that you're effectively selecting for overconfidence, right? You're building an overconfident team, which is something that really can come back and bite you in the end. And so we have this tendency to like select for overconfidence, even when we know in principle that it's a mistake to do so.
Yeah, like I tell my MBAs, the mark of an MBA, always confident, sometimes right. But I mean, we see it's not just in economic advice; it's in parenting advice, it's in nutritional advice, and you talk about some of those things like parenting and how everyone's desperate for some kind of advice, right?
The parenting story is, and let me complain about this for a sec, because so when our eldest daughter was 2, I guess, she didn't sleep very well. 2, 3, she didn't sleep very well. So we picked up like all the sleeping books, whatever, in the library. My wife is also a social scientist. And so, this is what we do. And we read all these books and we really didn't learn anything at all. Like they had completely opposite advice. So the attachment parenting people will say, you have to carry your child when they're crying, at all times, only put them down when they're firmly asleep, pick them up the moment they start crying. And then there are the other people who say, no, put it down, ignore it, go off, do something else, it'll learn. What was really most shocking to us was, other than the fact that the conclusions were like diametrically opposed, was that there was so little data in these books. The author would just say, oh, I've been a pediatrician for 30 years and I know this is true. But then somebody else would say, I've been a pediatrician for 40 years and I know the opposite is true, which gives you like no guidance, right? Really horrifying. And then worst of all was this sort of subtext that if you don't do it right, you will hurt your child, or you will, blunt your own emotional response, or whatever, which really left us. So we read these books and we were left feeling less competent and, more fearful than we had been before. And so instead, I went to PubMed, which is, a huge database of medical studies, and searched for like the best randomized controlled trial in this area. There's like real science of this. And the science shows that you can safely teach your child to sleep by putting them down for periods of time, and increasing that period of time as time goes by. And it was really shocking in this literature. There's like an enormous market catering to like very insecure parents, first-time parents in many cases, people who are suffering insomnia, right, in very many cases. And, as far as I can tell, right, these books do real harm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you guys are both social scientists and at a very advanced level. But I think, part of what your argument in the book is that everybody ought to be sort of an amateur social scientist. I mean, is there a way that we can
to some extent, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is there a way that we can give everybody a thin veneer? I mean, I think back to in the old days, in ancient rhetoric, they had this thing, the trivium, right? Logic and, rhetoric. And there was stuff that every educated person needs to know. And I kind of feel, and maybe I'm just being biased, but like a good, solid MBA education, like the core of an MBA. I mean, we teach data and decisions, and we teach economics for decision making, and we teach, social psychology. And so for people who get a good, solid MBA education, I think they would all do exactly what you did, which is if I'm going to raise a kid, I'm going to ask the question, and I'm going to do some research, and then I'm going to evaluate the research according to criteria, look at the sources. Did they run an experiment? What's the data? And so forth. I mean, it seems like everybody ought to have that just basic level of, how do you ask questions? How do you evaluate evidence? And that sort of thing. And yet it's still very rare.
That's exactly right. And this is not to say that everyone should get a PhD in economics, right? Or an MBA, right? This is clearly not doable. But we can all adopt this sort of way of thinking, right? The economic way of thinking. And we can apply it to ourselves and our families and our communities and our businesses. One area where this pops up is in the context of happiness, right? At the end of the day, how do you know what makes you happy? Well, there's heterogeneity, right? What makes you happy, Greg? It's not going to be the exact same thing that makes me happy. We can do science on like a population basis. We can compute estimates and parameters that capture like average effects. But at the end of the day, we have to be sensitive to what works for us, in context, right? Given where we are. And an idea that philosophers have advocated like since the 1800s is this idea that we should approach ourselves a little bit like a scientist would, experiment a bit, try out different experiments, do experiments in living, as Mill said, try different experiences, and then try to monitor, like, what is it that makes me happy? What is it that makes me miserable? And then do more and more of the good stuff. And, through a sort of process, a gradual improvement, sort of approach the thing that really makes us happy, and live a happy life. And this is something that modern happiness scientists, who've been at it for 100 years, right? Not 2,500. They've ended up in the same place. So many of them now will say that, well, what we need to do is to apply a little bit of this science to ourselves and observe what works and what doesn't. And so I think this idea really has legs. And it's true in a business setting, and it's true in a family, but it's also true just like when you reflect on your own life and what it is that makes you happy and not.
Yeah, I mean, this whole happiness economics, you said happiness studies, but it's now also happiness economics. I mean, this does seem like an extension of the behavioral economics trend, in that behavioral economics is mostly about bearing light, and then happiness economics is about bearing fruit. But also, I think behavioral economics was originally focused on the kinds of decisions that involved money. And now, more broadly, they involve the decisions that involve happiness. And I was wondering, I mean, you talk in the book about how you made the move to Sweden you had a wonderful job, nice house, and you had all the American dream and all that stuff, and you decided to up and move to to Sweden, where you got to ride your bicycle everywhere. I mean, well, maybe walk through how much did your understanding of the literature of happiness actually have an impact on how you made your decisions?
So I feel like my reading of the literature played a major role there. So the background was I was at George Mason, I had a great job. My wife and I lived in a beautiful house in the exurbs. And we were really very happy. We had lots of friends and whatever. And this opportunity to move back to Sweden, where I grew up, popped up. And there were advantages and disadvantages. So we'd have to give up a lot to leave the US. Salaries in Europe are much lower, for example. But then I could live closer to my parents, both of whom were still alive. And we had 3 kids at the time. Having family support means a lot, obviously, if you have children. The proximity to nature is something you can get in Sweden as well. There are much shorter commutes in the Stockholm area than in the DC area, which is like famous for its commutes, right? Or infamous, I should say. And sort of aggregating all these things, I decided that, we decided that where we were at the time, we'd be happier in Sweden. This is not to say that, there's one correct answer for everyone, right? It's not to say that life in Sweden is better than life in the DC area in general. It's just that for us, given where we were, it was better to live in Stockholm. And I think it turned out to be broadly correct. We might move back to the US again at some point, but for the time being, this works out for us. And in a way, like the strategy is, ancient, right? There's the T chart, as they call it, where you take a sheet of paper, you draw a straight line down the middle. Exactly, right? And then you write all the, you write plus on the one hand side, minus on the other, and then you add all the pros and all the cons. The only sort of twist on this method for us was that we tried to use sort of happiness science to assign weights to the various pros and cons involved in this decision. And I think this is as a general method, it's not a bad way to go about it. So, for example, many people just have to decide whether to stay close to the city center or to move further out in the suburbs, right? You can get a bigger house, but you have a longer commute. There's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that commutes are terrible for happiness. Like the morning and evening commutes are like the worst period of many people's days. And having a big home doesn't give you as much happiness as you might think. This was certainly our experience. Like we had a beautiful house in a wooded area of Fairfax Station outside of the DC area. And it was great in all sorts of ways, but the amount of effort involved in maintaining the property was just terrible. And it turned out that neither one of us was particularly amused by, doing handyman stuff or like yard work or whatever. And even when we outsourced everything, we still found that we had to spend a lot of time calling contractors, getting quotes, making decisions, meeting them at home. It isn't like, free. In terms of time to do that sort of thing. And so part of our move was to move back into an apartment. So we have a relatively spacious apartment now with balconies and things. And for us, this is perfect. It's like just the right amount of maintenance. For us, again, like this is not like the correct answer that works for everyone. But for 2 people who aren't very handy, who don't enjoy yard work very much, this is great.
Well, you liken economics to medicine. But medicine occupies 20% of GDP in the US? I mean, it's massive. And the kinds of decisions that are relevant to your health, like, hey, should I get surgery or radiation or whatever? I mean, those are largely shaped by experts, right? I mean, you don't go to Oprah to figure out whether you should get surgery or radiation. I mean, I guess some people do, but for the most part, like that 20% of GDP is your treatment plan is laid out by somebody who's got years and years of medical training. But it seems like for almost every other aspect of our life, which might be the domain of economics, like we don't have 20% of GDP devoted to whatever the economics profession, right? Telling everybody what to do.
Right.
And when you're trying to figure out like what job to take and where to live and how to raise your kids and stuff. I mean, we are kind of deferring to Oprah. I mean, why? Like, so, I mean, how do we
use 20% of GDP in grant funding if you don't mind?
Right?
Like, I can put that to good use. So it's true that, like, if you have a broken arm, right, you go to the emergency room and a surgeon is going to fix it or whatever. There's not going to be a whole lot of discussion about like what your goals are and what you want to accomplish. But in many other areas of medicine, these decisions do come up. The extreme case, I guess, is like epidemiology, right? So again, during the pandemic, epidemiologists were talking about like lockdowns and when should we open up and should we close schools and, you know, what about transit? And these are decisions that have to somehow integrate, you know, concern with health, right? Which means a concern with minimizing exposure to COVID-19, but it also means, you know, trying to minimize things like alcohol abuse and domestic abuse, right? And mental health concerns and so on. And there are other values at stake, like autonomy and whatever. And in other areas of medicine, these sorts of questions pop up as well, right? You might have a condition where there's a treatment, but the treatment is going to have side effects. And the doctor is going to come to you and say, well, you know, are these side effects something that you can live with? Or would you rather like live with a disease? So, you know, prostate cancer, right? There are all sorts of different interventions. You can choose not to do anything at all effectively, you know, watchful waiting. Or you can do more active interventions. Those interventions have costs in terms of, you know, impotence and incontinence and so on. And what can I, as a patient, you know, what sort of risks do I want to take? Well, those are matters of value. And those aren't questions that we should hand over to doctors to decide, right? These are decisions that we should make together with the practitioners, you know, who know the medicine, right? And those of us who are like on the receiving end of any treatment should have a voice. And I think that's true for economics as well, right? The decisions that we're making will reflect values, and the people who are on the receiving end of these interventions should have a say in that process. But the disanalogy with medicine is not as strong as you might think, right? There's a real parallel there.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the public has they underestimate the extent to which economists actually agree on things. So yes, well, there might be lots of debates about certain things. You talk about climate, right? And so if there is an agreement that we need to do something about carbon, like there's some super simple solutions that almost every economist would endorse, and yet you just don't see this stuff getting adopted. It's kind of puzzling. I mean, you can see why some people might oppose the implementation of something like a carbon tax for reasons of self-interest and so forth. But there isn't really a good economics argument against it if you believe in that goal, right? I mean, no economist would say, yeah, cafe standards are better than carbon tax. So is that heterogeneity? It's just completely manufactured. Why do people fail to appreciate the degree to which there is consensus around certain things?
Great questions. I mean, so there is a perception of economists as being sort of unable to agree, right? There are jokes to the effect that if you take 10 economists and, you know, line them up, they still won't reach a conclusion and whatever. But in some areas, they're really like overwhelmingly agreed. And one of those areas, as you pointed out, is like climate economics. So if we want to do something about the climate, economists, like 99% of economists are agreed that the way to do it is to have a carbon tax. That is, you know, you have to have a tax associated with causing the problem, internalizing the externality, as economists will say. And then what they want to do is to take that cash and distribute it across the population so that, you know, especially like poor people aren't hurt by the tax. You know, is it in the best of all worlds? Would we do this? No, right? In the best of all worlds, we wouldn't have externalities like this in the first place. But given where we are, economists are overwhelmingly agreed that this is the way to go. Now, I have colleagues who work on these things and who think about these things, and they'll say stuff like, well, what if everyone could just like, you know, fly less or drive less or whatever? But that's just fascinating because it's a beautiful thought, right? It's a fantasy, but it's not climate science or climate policy. Like, think about the crime situation. Nobody would try to solve the crime crisis by saying, what if people could just like crime less, right? Obviously not, right? You've got to have some sort of
I never
penalty
thought of that.
for the people who crime, right? And the same thing is true for the climate now, according to economists, right? If you really want to see large-scale change, you know, on a reasonable, rapid time frame, there has got to be penalties. And, you know, that means like a carbon tax or something much like it. I don't want to like exaggerate how easy this would be. There are obviously like problems of implementation, but the general outline of the policy is, I think, clear. This has been tested in various places on a smaller scale. It's been found to work. It's not guaranteed to work, but you know, we know enough about the problem. We know enough about the solution that we could act on it tomorrow if we wanted to.
Yeah, or take something like rent control that I mentioned earlier. I mean, I live in Berkeley, which has some of the strictest rent control in you know, in the world outside of, I don't know, Venezuela, and you know, there's also one of the most highly educated, you know, communities on the planet, and you know, you're not going to find an economist anywhere. I mean, even in like, you know, University of Venezuela, you know, like Cuba. I mean, you wouldn't even find an economist in Cuba that thinks rent control is going to somehow, you know, create more housing, right? And yet there are plenty of educated people here who just, you know, think this. I mean, how do we explain that? Is that just willful ignorance? Or is that,
part of it may be self-serving, right? So if you ask economists, what should you do about the housing crisis? I think overwhelmingly they would say, well, you have to increase supply. And what that means is that you have to relax zoning restrictions and so on so that people can build when they want to build. But people don't like that because it's going to hurt, you know, the character of the neighborhood or whatever. And so I guess it's just much easier to advocate rent control. But yeah, there's a real sort of illiteracy when it comes to economics. We see it in policy questions. We also see it on the private level, right? So overwhelmingly, if you ask people questions about interest rates and inflation or whatever across the world, like large shares of the population don't understand these concepts, right? And what that means is that majorities of the population don't have the skills required to make the kind of decisions that they have to make as a citizen of a modern, rich country in terms of like choosing mortgages, choosing credit cards, like saving for the future, planning for retirement, and so on. We have a system now that requires people to make decisions they're not equipped to make. And that strikes me as like a massive problem that we really ought to be doing something about. And it's connected, right? Because if people learned more about the one, they would maybe learn more about the other.
So who's the target of this book? Because I feel like the kind of people who are going to buy it, it's going to be preaching to the choir, you know, like myself.
So this is the problem, right? So I really want to reach people who don't think of themselves as economists, who don't think of themselves as particularly interested in economics, but who might nonetheless be a little curious, right? Or people who think, hey, I want to be like a little literate in this particular area, and here's a way to become more literate. But how do you do that? Well, you sort of have to have economics in the title, right? Or else you don't give people an idea of what's inside of the book. But if you put economics in the title, well, then, you know, the people who hate economics might not pick it up. So it's a real challenge. I did what I could to write it in an accessible kind of way, with very few technical terms, and where I explain things as well as I can. And you know, I'm so happy to be on your podcast to talk about this in like everyday language, hoping that somebody will listen to this and say, hey, maybe I should read the book and make up my own mind and whatever. And yeah, but it's a challenge.
it's rare to find an economist who speaks an ordinary language, and it's even rarer to find a philosopher that speaks an ordinary language. And so someone who's a philosopher of economics speaking an ordinary language is like doubly difficult. But I mean, are you also thinking that philosophers could be an audience? I mean, you're a professor of practical philosophy. Do you see philosophy changing in a way that allows it to kind of recapture some of those roots? You know, we talked about how political economy or social philosophy, there was before all the branching and the specializations, there was this idea of kind of a unified way of thinking about human experience. Right. Is there a move maybe to recapture some of that interdisciplinarity?
Well, one of my little projects here in the philosophy department and in the philosophy discipline is to sort of underscore how useful empirical research can be. So philosophers tend to think of themselves as sort of above empirical science and so on. There's this idea of philosophy as the queen of the sciences, issuing edicts in such a way that the scientists have to listen, but philosophy doesn't have to listen to the peasants, right? And that picture really doesn't work, because the way that we practice philosophy requires us to pay attention to the way society is organized and the way goods and services are produced and distributed and so on. So during my day job or whatever, I often emphasize the various ways in which science can help philosophers along. But then, outside of my day job or whatever, I make like the opposite case, which is that, philosophy can be useful to other people. But then when it comes to sort of science communication or whatever, I really look at the book not as like the final word on anything, right? I look at it as sort of the first move in an invitation to a conversation about these things. Because it's true that, realistic, rapid change, transition to a better future, whatever, is going to require every stakeholder to be involved in some way or other. We're going to need the values from the people out there. We're going to need the science from the people who know it. We're going to need the technological know-how from the people who know that. And the way to sort of get that process going is, I think, to build trust and to start a conversation about how we might do these sorts of things together. So if the book leads to a conversation along these lines, I'd be very happy, even if nobody like memorizes every conclusion in there or whatever. It's the trust and the conversation that are important at the stage, I think.
Well, last question. I mean, do you think that philosophers of science need to get their hands dirty? I mean, within the anthropological literature, there's a debate about how deeply involved in the culture you should become. Should you go native, right? Or should you stand outside the circle and just, take notes? If you're a philosopher of, experimental physics, I mean, should you actually learn how to, play around with protons and stuff? Like, should you do empirical research if you are a philosopher of economics?
You will be delighted to learn that the process you're describing is already underway. So back in the days of like Popper or whatever, you could sit in the coffee houses of Vienna and, pick up some ideas about psychoanalysis or Marxism or something. And then you could write entire books like criticizing Marxism and psychoanalysis and whatever. And part of why nobody takes Popper seriously anymore in the profession is that the stuff he said about the sciences was so wildly at variance with what was going on in those sciences. And so there's been a real revolution in philosophy of science. People sometimes talk about philosophy of science in practice that puts more weight on the study of scientific practice than scientific theory. And that's the sort of thing you kind of have to learn by doing. So many philosophers of science will immerse themselves in scientific communities, in laboratories, and so on, to get a sense for how people think, what they do, what sort of assumptions they make, and in part to get a handle on like all the implicit knowledge that's involved in like setting up laboratory experiments or whatever. There's a subdiscipline called experimental philosophy of science, where the boundaries between the theoretical and the empirical really break down. And as far as I'm concerned, these are all like wonderful developments. It's made philosophy of science so much more exciting to me and so much more relevant to the real problems that scientists are working on.
Well, Erik, thanks so much. So if you're not familiar with the methodology of economics, check this out. And if you are, check it out anyway. Thanks for joining me. Hope to chat again soon.
Thank you so much, Greg. It was a pleasure.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.